Our next speaker, Professor Timothy Powell, received his PhD in philosophy from St. Louis University in 2008 and is currently a professor in the Department of Philosophy at the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota. He specializes in metaphysics, medieval philosophy, moral psychology, and analytic theology. In metaphysics, he works on truth-maker theory, modality, and free will. In philosophical theology, he has published on transubstantiation, Christology, and divine immutability. In moral psychology, he has worked with psychologists on questions concerning how to best grow in virtue, and whether the traditional wisdom of the Christian moral tradition is conducive to such growth. In early 2019, he published his second book on Christology, entitled In Defense of Extended Conciliar Christology, a philosophical essay. In 2020, he published his third book entitled The Incarnation in the Cambridge Elements series on the philosophy of religion. Professor Powell was recently awarded an academic cross-training grant from the John Templeton Foundation for the 2018 to 2021 academic years. In addition to this recent grant, he has also led a grant with Gloria Frost called the Classical Theism Project, and another with Kevin Temp called Exploring the Interim State Writing Workshop. And perhaps most importantly, Professor Powell is married to another philosopher, Dr. Faith Glavy Powell, and is the proud father of one son and 4 daughters, all of whom I'm sure are well on their way to becoming philosophers as well. Professor Powell will be speaking to us today on Christian metaphysics in relation to a recent development in the academy, namely analytic theology. So yeah, I'll be excited to see what he has to say on this one. Professor Powell, thank you again for being here, and feel free to begin whenever you're ready.
Oh, super. Hey, thank you very much for that kind introduction. All those 5 kiddos are budding metaphysicians for sure. We taught our oldest the 4 causes when he was quite young, and took him out as like a party trick, like whenever we went to places, hey, Henry, what's the formal cause of this? And he would tell us, or what's the material cause of that? That's glass, Daddy. So yeah, we kind of stopped doing that with the younger ones because, boy golly, once you have a bunch of kids, you don't want to do anything extracurricular. You're just keeping them alive. But thank you all of you for sticking around for my talk. I know that for some of you, it's getting pretty close to dinner time, and so I appreciate you staying. I appreciate too the nice invite I got from Gavin and from Philip to come and speak here. I appreciate the forthcoming comments from Andrew that we'll be seeing a bit later, and also just all the other previous speakers and their commentators and their chairs as well. I think it's gone great. I look forward to seeing what happens next year, and I appreciate it. So thank you again. In the chat now, I'm trying to put a link. That link should take you to a handout I've made for the talk. And the goal is you can scroll through it at your leisure and follow along with what I'll be talking about. You guys, thumbs up if I can see your face, and you also, okay, got it. One of you humans said yes. 2, yes, good. It's there then, perfect. So the talk's on analytic theology and Christian metaphysics. And I want to talk a bit about what analytic theology is and about a sort of method it employs for showing consistency or inconsistency between metaphysical theses and Christian doctrines. That's the idea. So we'll see 2 test cases of this as we go on. 2 test cases of showing inconsistency between metaphysics and a Christian doctrine as examples. So what is it? Well, you can find a definition or something like a definition of it in the Oxford Studies in Analytic Theology series. that is edited by Oliver Crisp and Michael Ray. Each book begins with the following, or better, I should say, most of them begin with the following. And this is from your handout. So, quote, Analytic theology utilizes the tools and methods of contemporary analytic philosophy for the purposes of constructive Christian theology, paying attention to the Christian tradition and development of doctrine. Now, I say it says that for most, not all books, because they've also published books in Jewish analytic theology. And of course, no one doing Jewish analytic theology is trying to do constructive Christian theology. So it's been changed slightly to say constructive systematic theology, that sort of thing, or in religious traditions instead of Christian tradition. But notice, even though the word Christian is swapped out for other words there, what's going on in analytic theology stays the same there. It's employing the tools of analytic philosophy to do constructive Christian theology. And while this new way of doing it, analytic theology, while the term is relatively young, I think the term stems from 2009, the doing of it, I think, goes a fair bit before that. So you find folks, and I'll talk about this a bit more later, like Robert Adams and Marilyn McCord Adams and Eleanor Stump, doing this sort of thing many moons before 2009. So that's part of what it is. I should say too that though it's gotten its official name in 2009, it's taken off a fair bit, in no small part due to external funding it's been able to procure to keep going. So for instance, you have the Journal for Analytic Theology. It's an open source journal. You have the Oxford Studies series I just mentioned. You have at St. Andrews, the Logos Center for Exegetical and Analytic Theology. Lots of things propagating with respect to analytic theology. A second place you can look to see an answer to the what is it question is a very recent book by William Wood in that same Oxford Studies and Analytic Theology series, the book entitled Analytic Theology and the Academic Study of Religion. So there he says the following. Here's a quote again from your handout. Anyone who understands the sense in which Aquinas borrowed philosophical methods from Aristotle, or the sense in which Tillich borrowed philosophical methods from Heidegger, can grasp what analytic theology is to a reasonable degree of precision. The idea here being this sort of borrowing is nothing new. It's something that many other theologians have done in the past from excellent philosophical authors. And we see it here among the analytics, not so much as doing a different thing, but just taking a different target for the borrowing. Now, concerning the methods being borrowed, here are some that Wood lists in his recent book. Here again, he says, quote, formal logic is one of the methods borrowed. Concern for linguistic precision, counterfactual reasoning to determine what is possible, and the use of thought experiments to facilitate such reasoning. So those are some of the methods employed. I think he's fair to say, or he's right to say, those are employed in analytic philosophy. And he's certainly right to say that those are some of the key methods employed in analytic theology as well. But not only methods, but certain characteristics too are borrowed. So concerning representative characteristics of analytic theology, Wood writes the following. He says, quote, a concern for linguistic precision, logical rigor, and linear argument, along with a strong commitment to transparent writing, end quote. So that's a brief, what is it? What are some methods it employs? And what are some of its characteristics? What are some of its representative characteristics that it has? I want to say here, as a way of defraying potential objections, that there's at least three senses, and surely more, in which analytic theology is not anything novel. So one sense is the sense of what it's doing. So what it's doing is borrowing philosophical tools for theological ends. And that borrowing is nothing new. As Wood said earlier, you find it in previous authors. So that's not a way in which analytic theology is differentiated from other sorts of theology. And in fact, the good sought, this is the second sense, the good sought aren't anything novel either. So the good of linear argumentation, the good of linguistic precision, these are not things you don't find in other sorts of theology. certainly no one would say that continental theology, for instance, isn't looking for rigor or isn't looking for clarity. Of course they are. So the claims here aren't, here are things analytic theology does and nobody else does. Here are things analytic theology does and is trying hard to do well, which certainly other sorts of theology do too. Now, you can see this especially, that the good sought are not novel, I think, in looking at the scholastics. You can see it in Aquinas, but I think you can see it even more clearly in the scholastics that came after Aquinas. So for instance, you can read anything, very many things by Scotus or Occam or Suarez. Well, you'll find a paragraph that goes something like this. The minor premise is yada, yada, yada. And the major premise is yada, yada, yada. And proof for the minor is the following. And for the major, I differentiate two ways of employing a term. And in the first way, the consequence does not follow, but in the second way, it does. So I use it the second way. That sort of careful attention to logical rigor and careful attention to what exactly the terms mean and careful attention to logical deduction is something you clearly find in the scholastics, and you find an even heightened way in the neo-scholastics, especially the manuals some of you were talking about earlier. We find that in spades. So I think this sort of borrowing for the sake of certain goods is not itself a novel thing for analytic theology. And finally, as I said briefly earlier, the doing of analytic theology predates the term by many decades. So again, you find it in the work of Eleanor Stump and the Adamses and Swinburne and many others. So in at least those three ways, and again, likely many more, analytic theology isn't a novel thing, but it's still a thing that's somewhat recently named and intentionally explicitly practiced by people. And so that's what I'm taking as my target in this talk, or the thing I'm talking about. You might think then of analytic theology as a theologically constructive enterprise which employs the tools and methods of analytic philosophy, often taking as data the deliverances of Christian tradition and doctrine. And it's that last part that makes it Christian analytic theology instead of Jewish tradition and doctrine, which would make it Jewish analytic theology, and so on. And I think of a metaphysics as Christian when it's, and I have this here on your handout too, minimally when its constituents are consistent with, and in fact informed by, the deliverances of tradition and doctrine from Christianity. And so we can see, given these two understandings of a Christian metaphysics and analytic theology, this Christian analytic theology, there's a tight relation between the two. Both of them are regulated by Christian deliverances. One difference between the two is that of final cause, what they're for. So the former, that is Christian analytic theology, aims at constructive theology. That's part of what it's for. That's what it's doing. Whereas the latter has no explicit theological aim built into it. That is to say, one can do Christian metaphysics. One can do metaphysics as a Christian, trying hard to have one's metaphysics reined in by the doctrinal teachings of the church, and at the same time not be trying to do any theology as well at all. You know, maybe I'm trying to do stuff on free will, and I want to make sure what I say isn't inconsistent with church teaching, but I'm not trying to do theology of free will. I'm trying to show maybe that we have it, or that it's consistent with determinism, or whatever it is I'm trying to show. Important to both analytic theology and Christian metaphysics is the consistency of theological doctrine with metaphysical thesis. That consistency is really important. For, were a metaphysical thesis inconsistent with the Christian doctrine, there's no good sense in which it could be part of a Christian metaphysics, or a firm foundation, or a firm building block for a Christian analytic theology. For example, Jim Stone has argued in print that there are no persons, and others have argued that there's no soul or there's no freedom. We can see how any of those three claims would be problematic for a Christian metaphysics or a Christian analytic theology. And they'd be problematic precisely because the Christian bit of Christian metaphysics implies there are persons, implies there are souls, and implies that there are some free acts. Whereas the metaphysical claims in question imply the contrary. That since you can't have a contradiction be true, you can't have both be right. So I hope you see what I take analytic theology to be, how I see it as related to Christian metaphysics, how Christian metaphysics and analytic theology are related to each other, and how you need consistency in the Christian metaphysics, and that precludes certain metaphysical theses, like the claim that there are no persons. What I want to do for the remainder of the talk is I want to talk about two different metaphysical theses, which are alive in the contemporary analytic debates, which I think are precluded by Christian doctrine. And so I want to show two test cases of how one can go about showing that a Christian metaphysics can't employ a certain commonly accepted metaphysical claim from the analytic tradition. These are test cases, so the idea is you can extrapolate from the two to other ways and other places where you can test Christian thought against metaphysical thesis and see whether there is a consistent Christian metaphysics to be built out of that metaphysical thesis with the Christian doctrine. And the place I'll be looking for these is in something called truth-maker theory, which is part of analytic philosophical thought these days. So I've worked these out, these two forthcoming brief arguments. I've worked them out in more detail in a paper in the American Catholic Philosophical Association, published in 2017. So if you want to see more of it, I can send you the paper. But here's how it goes. Contemporary analytic philosophers use the term truth maker to designate that part or those parts of the world in virtue of which some proposition is true. So that there are elephants is true, and it's true in virtue of each individual elephant. Or that I'm sitting is a true proposition, and that proposition is true in virtue of, well, me plus my sitting accident, the way in which my body is arranged. So truth depends on how the world is the insight here. And though it's the contemporary analytic philosophers that I think have used the word truth maker, have coined it and presented it, you find the idea that propositions need some bit of reality to make them true. You find it easily in the medieval era too. So one of Aquinas's contemporaries, Raymond Lull, had a term he employed, Verificativum, which quite literally in English means truth maker. And the 17th century Jesuits spilt a lot of ink on the question of what it is that's the fundamentum in re, the grounding in reality for the truth of some assertion or proposition. So while you don't find the term in Aquinas' thought, you find it in some of his contemporaries, you find it certainly in those downstream from him in medieval philosophy and metaphysics. And you find something similar in Aquinas. So here's an example, just one of many you could give on your handout from Aquinas. Aquinas says, this is in his commentary on the metaphysics, he says, quote, "When I say Socrates is a man, the truth of this statement is caused by the composition of the human form with the individual matter, by which Socrates is this man. And when I say the man is white, the cause of this truth is the composition of whiteness with the subject. And it is similar in other cases. Here he's speaking of cause, but the idea I think is clear enough. The thing which explains, or the thing in virtue of which Socrates is a man is true, is that composition of a human form or soul with the individual matter, that is the matter that Socrates has. Or if you say, Tim is a human is going to be true because of my soul and this individual matter here being composed together. And likewise in other cases. A contemporary analytic metaphysician, David Lewis, said something like this. Here's a quote. "No two possibilities can differ about what's true unless they also differ in what things are or in how they are. Truths are about things, they don't float in the void." The idea being here that truths require the world to be a certain way. The world's got to be a way for there are elephants to be true. And the world's got to be a way for Christ as God and man to be true. So that's what contemporary folks mean by truth maker, and where you find it, at least I think, in earlier discussions, including places where Aquinas is doing work, even if he doesn't use the term. There's one feature of truth making that's important for the forthcoming two arguments that I'm going to give. And that feature is called necessitation. And you've got that there on your handout as well. And the idea is this: if there's something, call it T, that's a truth maker for a proposition, then whenever both that thing and that proposition exists, that proposition is true. That is, the existence of a truth maker is sufficient to set the truth value of a proposition to true. The existence of Fido is sufficient to set the truth value of the proposition some dogs exist to true. So that's an idea of what's a necessary condition for truth making, but it's not a sufficient condition. Nobody that I know of argues it is a sufficient condition. And you can see why if you consider any necessary proposition. Take the proposition that 2 + 2 = 4, or the proposition that God is triune, or pick your favorite necessary proposition and insert it into here. Well, anytime anything exists at all will be a time at which that proposition is true. So anytime I exist is a time at which 2 + 2 = 4. And so it follows that putting me in for T and 2 + 2 = 4 for the proposition, you get the claim that I'm a truth maker for 2 + 2 = 4. And for good reason, I think lots of people scoff at that sort of claim. I'm not the thing that makes it true that 2 + 2 = 4. I'm not the thing that makes it true that God is triune. And so it's false that necessitation is sufficient for truth making, but it is necessary. It's got to be the case that the thing, if it exists, makes the proposition true, even if the converse isn't right, even if it's not the case that anytime that thing exists, the proposition is true, that makes this the truth maker. Because anytime I exist, all those necessary truths are true, but I'm not the truth maker for those necessary truths. I'm not the part of reality in virtue of which it's true. Okay. Let's start then with the two live possibilities in the contemporary truth maker debate. I'm going to give them both, and then I'm going to talk about how they're inconsistent with different doctrines. And generally, I'm thinking here of Catholic doctrines. I should make that explicit. I thought the context would make it not impermissible to presuppose Catholic doctrine, at least in this first example I'm giving. In the second, I think generally, just about any monotheism of a traditional sort will have the same sort of argumentation I give later. But this first one requires transubstantiation, and I know that's, well, it's disagreed upon doctrine. Okay, the first live possibility in the contemporary truth maker debate is something called the property alone thesis. And it's called that, now that I think about it, by me. I coined that term, so I guess I shouldn't say it's just something people call that. It's something I've called that now once, and I guess twice in a conversation with you people. Goes like this: the truth maker for contingent, intrinsic, predicative truths is the individual property of the subject, and that property alone. Here's the idea: the truth maker for Dr. Paul is sitting, or for Tim is sitting, is just my sitting accidental feature. The truth maker for Socrates is wise, is just Socrates' wisdom. That's the idea. And you can find this, you don't have to look very hard, you can find it in the contemporary metaphysical discussions. So here are just two examples, one from E.J. Lowe. E.J. Lowe writes of Dobbin the horse. He writes, quote, "Dobbin is white in virtue of being characterized by a certain whiteness mode, call it W." Pause. Just let me say, this is on your handout if you want to read along. Unpause. Now it is part of the essence of W that it characterizes Dobbin, since W depends for its identity on Dobbin. Equally, it is part of the essence of W that it instantiates the attribute whiteness. Hence, in any possible world in which W exists, W instantiates whiteness and characterizes Dobbin. Whence it follows that in any world, such world, it is true that Dobbin is white, since he is characterized by a whiteness mode in that world. And here's the important part. Thus, W is a truth maker for the proposition that Dobbin is white, as indeed would be any whiteness mode of Dobbin. Here, the important thing to note is that it's W that's the truth maker. W, again, just being a certain whiteness mode, or whiteness trope, or whiteness accident, or whiteness attribute of the thing. And you see it again in Rodriguez Pereira, who writes, quote, If one postulates tropes or modes or particularized properties, as they are sometimes called, one can account for the truth makers for contingent propositions, provided the tropes in question are non-transferable. That is, provided that any trope that characterizes a certain particular cannot characterize another particular. In that case, tropes can be the truth makers for the relevant propositions. For instance, the rose's redness is the truth maker for the proposition that the rose is red. And there is no conflict with truth maker necessitarianism. That's the same thing as truth maker necessitation. Since it is impossible for the rose's redness to exist, and the proposition that the rose is red not be true. Here we see the same thing. The rose's redness is the truth maker for the proposition. And they both give similar reasoning as to why. The idea is this. Tropes or modes or accidents are things that are non-transferable and they can't change what type they are. You know, like my sitting accident can't become a courageous accident. It's just the sort of thing it is, and it has to be that sort of thing. And if it's not transferable, and it's the sort of thing it is essentially, then it alone can be the truth maker, both these thinkers think. Now we saw Aquinas didn't take that view. Aquinas thought you needed composition, not just the accident itself, but the accidents in composition with the subject. That's why Aquinas said earlier, the man is white is caused to be true in the composition of whiteness with the subject. But these thinkers are saying otherwise. Okay, so Aquinas agrees with part of what they're saying. He agrees with the non-transferability of properties. There's just one quotation there on your handout. He says, quote, accidents do not pass from subject to subject, so that the same identical accident, which was first in one subject, be afterwards in another. So we see him accepting part of their reasoning, but we'll see a bit later with respect to transubstantiation why he doesn't accept all of the reasoning. So that's the first live possibility. The second live possibility is what's sometimes called truth maker maximalism, the thesis that every truth requires a truth maker. And there are two examples of truth maker maximalism that I'm going to bring up in the contemporary analytic debates. One is David Armstrong, who asks, quote, do all truths have truth makers? Or are there some areas of truth that are truth maker free? Modal truths, for instance. And he goes on to answer it in the affirmative. He says that every truth has a truth maker. Similarly, for Ross Cameron, he begins his writing of a defense of the thesis truth maker maximalism by saying this, quote, let us, following Armstrong, call the claim that all true propositions without exception have a truth maker maximalism. So those are the two targets I'll be considering in the forthcoming argumentation, the property alone thesis and the truth maker maximalism thesis. And I think both of those we're going to see are dead on dogma. That is to say, given the dogma of the Catholic Church for the first, and given traditional Christian teaching for the second, we'll see there's an inconsistency here between the analytic philosophical thesis put forward and a Christian view. So both can't be part of a Christian metaphysics. Consider the first, consider the doctrine of transubstantiation. As you, I'm sure, will know, on that doctrine, what was once bread is transformed whole and entire into the body of Christ. And along with it, you get the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ, such that the bread is no longer there on the altar. On Aquinas' understanding of the ontology of the sacrament, the accidental forms of the bread remain in existence where they were, though all the accidents but the dimensive quantity now inhere in the dimensive quantity, and the dimensive quantity doesn't inhere in anything at all. So that's Aquinas' view. Now, John Wycliffe denied this metaphysical view. He claimed that accidents do not continue existing without the bread on the altar. And in response to his denial, the Ecumenical Council of Constance, that is, ecumenical on the Catholic reckoning of things, not on the Eastern Orthodox reckoning of things, but the Ecumenical Council of Constance condemned the following proposition from Wycliffe's works. So this, what I'm telling you now, is a condemned proposition. The accidents of bread do not remain without their subject in the said sacrament. And in fact, the council went on to say that it, quote, forbids each and every Catholic henceforth, under pain of anathema, to preach, teach, or affirm in public the said articles or any one of them in particular. They had a bunch of things said by John Wycliffe, and they're all condemned. There are things concerning necessity and free will as well in there. But the one that's most relevant for us in this circumstance is this one concerning accidents not remaining. Okay, so take that all as theological data to employ in our argumentation. And now consider that doctrine of transubstantiation along with the property alone thesis. Put them together, shake them up, and see what results. And I think what results is a contradiction. On Lowe and Rodriguez Pereira's view, the accident alone is a truth maker for the predication, the bread is white. Now they talked about a horse being white or a rose being red, but surely the same thing applies for bread. So the bread is white is made true by the accident alone. At consecration, the bread ceases to exist. Since the bread is not, it is not white, and that's because something has to exist to be colored. Thus, the predication, the bread is white, cannot be true post-consecration. However, if Lowe is right, then the proposition is true given necessitation, since a truth maker for that proposition, the whiteness accident, exists at that time. Now, however, we have derived a contradiction. The proposition is both true, true given necessitation, and false, false given the dogma. Thus, the first live possibility is dead on dogma. A Catholic metaphysics ought not to include the property alone thesis. You see how the reasoning goes. If the property alone thesis says the accident alone does the truth-making work, and the accident alone exists, by necessitation, the proposition is true. The bread is white is true. If transubstantiation has occurred, there's no bread there, strictly so called. The bread entity has been changed whole entire. If that's the case, then it's false to say the bread is white. But it can't be both true that the bread is white and false that the bread is white. And so we have a contradiction between this doctrine and this metaphysical thesis. One of them has to go. The second live view, that being truth maker maximalism and some other teachings. These teachings now are, and this is again on your handout, first, that God creates freely, and second, that anything aside from God that exists is created by God. Suppose those two teachings, for argument's sake, are true, and let's see what follows concerning truth maker maximalism. According to the traditional Christian teaching concerning God's creative power, God is the creator of all things visible and invisible, as many creeds of the church say. And so we find doctrinal manualists saying, like Ludwig Ott here and Joseph Powell, saying things like this. Ludwig Ott says it's a de fide truth of the Catholic faith that, quote, all that exists outside God was, in its whole substance, produced out of nothing, end quote. And Powell claims similarly that God is the creator of all that exists that is not God. If you go to Vatican I, you'll see they said the following. They said, if anyone does not confess that the world and all things which are contained in it, both spiritual and material, were produced according to their whole substance out of nothing by God, or holds that God did not create by his free will, by his will free from all necessity, but says instead that God created as he necessarily loves himself, let him be anathema. So I think we've got some reason for thinking that the claims that God creates freely and that anything aside from God that exists is created by God are true. Those I think are on firm footing. And like I said earlier, you can look elsewhere and see it taught by other Christians. You can see it taught by Maimonides too in his Guide for the Perplexed. So these are not idiosyncratic teachings about a creator God. Now consider those claims along with truth maker maximalism and see what happens. Well, this inference is on your handout too. Since God creates of his own free will, free from all necessity to create, it is possible that he not create anything. And if he doesn't create anything, there would be nothing in that possible world but God alone. given that God creates everything that is not God. That is, God would be the only thing that exists. Now, in such a world, there are no dogs. God, being omniscient, would know that truth. Now, what could make that truth true? That is, in a world with God and only God, which seems like a possibility, given the doctrine in question, in a world with God and only God, God knows there are no dogs. What makes the proposition there are no dogs true in such a situation? By hypothesis, the only thing there to make anything true is God. So, given truth maker maximalism, God would need to be the truth maker for that truth. But God is not a truth maker for that there are no dogs. And we know this because both God and dogs exist in our actual world. If God were a truth maker for the proposition that there are no dogs, and dogs are truth makers for the proposition that there are dogs, a contradiction would be true, given necessitation. For by necessitation, both the propositions that there are dogs and that there are no dogs would be true, given the existence of both God and dogs. So, the conjunction of truth maker maximalism and the traditional Christian doctrine in question is inconsistent. And thus, if the doctrines are true, then truth maker maximalism is false. A Catholic metaphysics ought not to include truth maker maximalism. Okay, so what have I done there? I've tried to do the following. I've tried to show us two fairly common theses in contemporary analytic philosophy, and tried to show how if you employ some Christian data into your inference pool, into the things you're allowed to use as premises, you can derive contradictions from those things. And that itself, I think, is a good test for whether that thesis, the metaphysical thesis, is a viable contender for being part of a Christian metaphysics. A general principle being, if together with Christian doctrine entails a contradiction, don't add it in for your Christian metaphysics. So that's what I've been up to here. I think the open vistas for a Christian metaphysics depend on the deliverances of Christian doctrine. For such doctrines, as we've seen, can be surprisingly far-reaching or can have surprisingly far-reaching implications. One way to test a metaphysical thesis for consistency with Christian doctrine is, as we've seen here, to assume both the doctrine and the thesis for the sake of argument, then see if we can derive a contradiction. Such a contradiction alone doesn't show which of our assumptions is false. It could be that Christian doctrine is false. It could be that the metaphysical thesis is false. From what we said so far, we haven't shown either way. But it does show, it does show that the acceptance of both is folly. And so if one wants a Christian metaphysics or a Christian analytic theology, one ought not to accept that metaphysical doctrine. The thing I think to note here is the methodology I've employed so far in this paper. The methodology here is a methodology taken from analytic philosophy and employed in analytic Christian theology for the sake of trying to build up a Christian metaphysics. And so you can see the interrelations, the close interrelations between analytic theology on the one hand and Christian metaphysics on the other. Okay, thank you.
Okay, great. That was fantastic. Thank you, Professor Powell. I'll now hand it over briefly to Dr. Andrew Mazaros, a lecturer in systematic theology here at St. Patrick's College.
Great. Thank you, Micah. Can everyone hear me? Is that right? Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Timothy Powell, for delivering this paper to us. And I'd also like to thank Dr. Philip Gonzalez and Gavin Kerr for inviting me to offer this brief response. Reading Dr. Powell's paper was like walking down memory lane. While I make absolutely no claim to being an analytic theologian, nor do I claim any real proficiency in the analytic tradition, I did have the privilege of immersing myself in analytic philosophy for an entire academic year at Oxford during my junior year abroad, an experience whose contrast with the historical, ancient, medieval philosophy coupled with continental philosophy that I received as a philosophy major at Boston College couldn't be starker. At BC, we never discussed the brain and bat hypothesis or knowledge as justified true belief. Dr. Powell's paper indeed contained the quintessential markers of the analytic style: clarity and precision in writing, often reverting to symbols and helpful thought experiments, the quirkier the better, to keep things concrete, even if these things are meant to reflect the counterfactual rather than the actual. With this style, Paul deploys an argumentative method whereby two different kinds of so-called metaphysics of truth-making are shown to be incompatible with Christian dogma, to which an Orthodox Christian is committed. I won't repeat these arguments, for you just heard them, but I would thank Dr. Paul for taking the time and effort to show clearly why these particular varieties of truth-making are indeed problematic. It is not enough for property alone to render true a contingent predicative proposition. I completely agree. It would seem Aquinas, and Aristotle for that matter, is right. What makes such a contingent predicative proposition true is not only the accident, but the accident in composition with the subject in which it inheres. The property, which is expressed by a proposition's predicate, must inhere in the substance that is expressed by the proposition's subject. I must confess, however, that the way in which Tim disabuses us of the truth-maker maximalism confuses me, and I wonder whether he might be able to shed some more light on it during the Q&A. I never thought of myself as a truth-maker maximalist, but if the position holds that every truth requires a truth-maker, or that every truth for it to be true must correspond to reality, then I'm tempted to join the maximalist club. But I wonder whether in certain cases, such as negation, the correspondence or truth maker, truth bearer way of approaching things doesn't cause more problems than it solves. I acknowledge here that I might be misinterpreting this line of thought, so bear with me if I'm misrepresenting what is at issue. The reason Tim gives for why God cannot be a truth maker for the proposition, there are no dogs, is because, and I quote, God and dogs exist in our actual world. But my question is, does it even make sense to seek out a truth maker for what is ultimately a negation? There are no dogs. I agree that God can't be a truth maker for the proposition, there are no dogs, but I struggle to see how it wouldn't simply be the case that the proposition, there are no dogs, is rendered true by the circumstances in which this counterfactual world, nothing exists. But if there is nothing, there is no thing that can cause, in the proper philosophical sense of the word cause, there's no thing that can cause a reality to be true, and hence no thing to cause the proposition that expresses that reality to be true. I hope you're following me, because I can't share my hand out. So now we're at the level of talking about existence. And this is where I believe Aquinas can help us. Things for Aquinas are not only truth makers, but also truth bearers. Conversely, it's not just propositions or, and I would stress this, intellects, which are truth bearers, yeah? So it's not just propositions or intellects which utter them that are truth bearing. In the Veritate, Aquinas holds that there is a truth of things, analogically, obviously, but there are still a truth of things, created things which lie between two intellects, the created and the uncreated. For Aquinas, a thing is said to be true because it both fulfills the end to which the divine intellect created it, and because it can cause truth in the created intellect who apprehends it. And so if truth is in the intellect, then we can also analogically attribute truth to the thing which causes that truth in both the created intellect that apprehends it, and then in the divine intellect who wills it into existence. Does the proposition, there are no dogs, really require a truth maker? One might say that the circumstances in which only God exists can make that proposition true, but here circumstances or situations which make something true is quite different than a being who is in act causing truth in the intellect. But if things themselves can be said to be true by virtue of their fulfilling the divine intellect and causing truth in the created, then I still might consider myself a truth maker maximalist, albeit one that the typical authors who promote such a theory would repudiate. In other words, I'm using truth maker maximalism in a completely equivocal way. So my first question to Dr. Paul is whether or not we actually need a truth maker for negations like the example given. In other words, what does analytic philosophy offer that, say, Aquinas' metaphysics and teaching on truth cannot do. My second question is, after having eliminated two faulty metaphysical views, namely the property alone thesis and truth-making maximalism, what is the alternative that Dr. Powell proposes? I'd be very interested in that because I think you're doing us a great service in eliminating two, but then that just whets the appetite for what the actual solution might be. And my third and broader question is, what for Dr. Powell are the unique virtues of analytic philosophy that assist theologians? When appealing to a philosophical tradition to assist us in doing theology, it seems to me that theologians tend towards not simply what is on offer, not only to what is conducive to doing theology, but also to a philosophy that asks similar questions to what the gospel provides answers. What is the true? What is the good? What is the beautiful? What is the good life, etc.? In appealing to classical philosophy, theologians naturally modify or amend philosophers' teaching as needed. Dr. Powell acknowledges, for example, that consistency with Christian doctrine is only a minimal requirement for a metaphysics to be Christian. But given the history surrounding the emergence of analytic philosophy, namely that its method and style were closely connected to a heavily, if not exclusively empiricist worldview and the breakdown of participatory metaphysics, why embrace analytic philosophy while having to weed out the problems it causes? And this seems especially relevant at a time when the academy is so variegated, where there seems to be no common method or no common theological language or grammar, and I think we're kind of starved for it. Or perhaps it might be the case that analytic theology is doing an apologetic service to all Christians when they engage tirelessly with analytic philosophical theses and show which ones are indeed consistent and which ones are not with the Christian faith. So thanks again to Tim for his paper and for bringing to the fore certain seminal questions about theological method. It's very much appreciated and it was a pleasure to read. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew.
Okay, Dr. Mazzaros, thank you for your insightful response. I think you've brought up a lot of good questions. So before we open up the chat, Dr. Powell, would you like the chance to respond to some of Andrew's inquiries?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Thank you again, Andrew. You guys can see why I thanked him preemptively, because I knew it was coming and I knew it was going to be good, and I wasn't wrong. So you ended with three questions for me, and I think I'll try somewhat briefly to at least touch on each of those three. To the first, you asked, do we really need a truth maker for negations, like the example given above? And I think the answer to that question is no. I think we don't need a truth maker for those. Now, there are arguments why you would need such a thing, but I think they're invalid or unsound. Better to say, I think they're unsound. And the reason, at least part of the reason why I think that, is because I do think the data from theology is true, and it contradicts maximalism. And so I don't think we need a truth maker for claims like there are no dogs. So I'm in agreement with you there that we don't really need such a thing. The problem is just that lots of folks seem to think we do, and if they're right, then Catholicism at least is wrong. Okay, second question you asked, after eliminating the faulty metaphysical views, what's the positive thing I offer? And I appreciate the question. In the paper here, what I was trying to do was just show two examples to generalize of how one goes about testing consistency for metaphysics with respect to Catholic or Christian teaching. And so the goal wasn't so much to give you the views I think are right afterwards, but just to show how to do it. But since you asked, I think for the first view, I think property alone is false, but I think that Aquinas probably has it right when he says you don't need just the property, you don't need just the subject, you need them bound together. You need the composition, the hylomorphic compound of property and subject to get the truth. And I think that's only likely true for true positive contingent predications. Sort of a mouthful, but I think for necessary ones, like Tim is an animal, you probably don't need animality as an accident, which inheres in me. So contingent ones, I think, are the ones we're focusing on. For negative ones, like not 15 feet from a hippopotamus, well, I'm pretty sure that's true of me, but I don't think I need some inhering accident to make it true that I'm not 15 feet from a hippopotamus. So that's why I said positive. So positive contingent predications, I think, probably require some inhering thing and the composition in question. And the third thing you asked was, what are the unique virtues of analytic philosophy that assist theologians? And unique's a tricky word in that question. If it means virtues had only by analytic philosophy and which assist theologians, I don't think there are any. Yeah, full stop, I don't think there are any. I think the virtues you find in analytic philosophy that are helpful to theology are similar to the ones you find in scholastic philosophy, properly so called, that are helpful to theology. So the clarity of argument, the clear derivation of form, citing inference forms like from Barbara 1 and 2 entail 3, or from modus ponens 1 and 2 entail 3. From my intellectual predilections, I enjoy seeing the reasoning structure, knowing exactly how many premises, knowing which one I'm going to pick at to say that the conclusion doesn't follow. That's my predilection for intellectual work, is that sort of narrowed version. I realize it's not everybody's. In fact, I'm happy we've seen so many different ways of going about this sort of question today in all the talks and comments we've had. So, but in any case, I think that's at least one good way of doing it. And I think you find that good way especially well worked out in analytic philosophy, even though it's not unique to analytic philosophy. Thanks.
Andrew, is that good for you?
Yeah, I appreciate it very much. And I especially appreciate, again, speaking as a theologian, not as a philosopher, but I do find that much theology today would be helped by a heavy dose of rigor. And especially if we consider theology as a scientia, and that if the paradigmatic case of the scientia is indeed some kind of logical demonstration, then I think even if we don't have to put it in pure form, but that should be informing our writing, I think. And I think that's a helpful reminder for all theologians and philosophers for that matter. But I know that's one thing that I suppose theologians should take to heart, in not only in the analytic tradition, but as you say, more broadly in the medieval and scholastic tradition as well. But thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Yeah, you're welcome. I just want to say the manualists, I think, for all the denigration they get, some of which I think is deserved, the manualists did an excellent job of trying to give scientific demonstrations of the things they're arguing for. I think you probably shouldn't just start and stop with the manualists, but they do a great service, and I think they're good to look at. If you look next to this ear of mine, that's my manualist shelf right there.
I say, yeah, the critique is always that there's a danger of reductionism, but I suppose the virtue is trying to seek out the higher principles and ultimately working out the highest principles and achieving some kind of wisdom and the highest causes.
All right, well, it looks like we have quite a few questions on the chat, so let's go ahead and get started on those.
Okay.
The first is from Ida Soldini. Dear Tim, what about the metaphysics of David Lewis? He has written a lot about a very questionable anti-Christian theology, and it seems to me that many analytic philosophers agree with him. Mm-hmm. And then I think he added on to it, a little bit later. And how do you think it is possible to speak with such people? Yeah,
that's a good question. I think if we distinguish between a school and a method, we can see that there's the method employed by David Lewis. And it's in fact, I think, and Peter Van Inwagen thinks, the same method Peter Van Inwagen uses for his own philosophy as well. A school, we might say, is not only the method, but also some metaphysical principles that you add to the method and then work forward from. So I think for people like David Lewis, I think you can speak with him and you can do like what Peter Van Inwagen did with him. They have these, I wish I could remember where it is, but they have a great debate where they basically praise each other a bunch for being really, really good metaphysicians, but then go on to disagree a bunch with many of the conclusions drawn, not because it's invalid derivations, but because they're employing premises that the other one doesn't accept as part of its, its foundational structure. So I do think you can talk with them. I think that the shared method is one means by which you can talk with them. And I think that even though David Lewis has views contrary to the Christian faith in what he argues for in some places, that said, it's precisely because he shares a method with Peter Van Inwagen that Peter Van Inwagen, a Christian, an Anglican, could argue back against the views of David Lewis. It's the same thing you find with people like Avicenna and Aquinas. Not that they had a back and forth, but you can find Aquinas arguing against the views of Avicenna, and doing so with good, clear philosophical arguments in a tradition not quite shared by the two. There's a sense in which there's a shared tradition of Aristotelian syllogism, but I think you see the same sort of thing there.
Okay, great. So our next question is from Dr. Gilson. This is fascinating, though I'm wondering how we can enter into the depths of a specifically Christian metaphysics of persons within an analytic framework, i.e., in danger of going from a logical atomism to a kind of spiritual atomism. Can an analytic theology enter into or do a specifically Christian theology, or is it philosophy employing or putting on theological terms?
Well, I certainly hope the answer is it can. I think there's a principle in at least the sort of metaphysics I do that possibility follows from actuality. So if you can find it actually happening, you can show that it can possibly happen. And I think the best place to look to find it actually happening is the work of Eleanor Stump on persons. She does excellent work on it. I think somebody who was, maybe still is in our chat here, Scott Williams, I think does excellent work on persons from an analytic perspective, but also a medieval perspective. So the hope is, and I think they succeed at doing a good, deliberate, careful Christian view of persons, or giving a careful Christian view of persons without falling into any of the problems rife in analytic philosophy. Surely there are some. There are excesses and weirdnesses. And I guess I'd say, if you go look there, you might find the sort of thing that you're asking about. Thanks for the question.
All right, so up next, we have a question from Nathan Williams. Can you gesture toward how an analytic Christian theologian navigates the development of Christian doctrine?
Yeah, boy, I could try, Nathan. I don't know much written on this topic in analytic theology. It could be in part because, well, I was going to say it could be in part because many of the practitioners are Protestant, and so don't have a well worked out like Newman's theory of the development of doctrine. That said, Oliver Crisp has an excellent new book, or recent book. I can't say new because he writes one every other day, so it's at least recent, I can say. A new recent book on the development, or on Christian doctrine at least. And I think he's got some good stuff in there that might be helpful. But speaking, at least from me anyway, how do I deal with the development of doctrine? It's tricky business if you really think the Lord is guiding his church. So here I'm speaking with my Roman Catholic hat on. If you think the Lord is guiding his church and keeping it free from doctrinal error, then what you get is new sources of data to use when the church has a development of doctrine. And since it's free from error, given the supposition concerning the Holy Spirit's work, since it's free from error, it's got to be consistent with the previous stuff. And so the developed doctrine, the new stuff that you have, has to be read in light of the old stuff, and vice versa. You can't just lop off one half and work with that. So I think of it, this might not be a helpful analogy, but I sometimes think of the analogy of the philosophy of science and how it takes the data of science and then employs it using philosophical methodology to try to glean insights about how to do science well or poorly, about what science shows or doesn't show. I think there's a sense, it's only a sense, it's not the only sense, but there's a sense in which philosophy can do the same for theology, looking at the data of theology. And so what it amounts to then is like a new data dump that occurs when the scientists get a new bunch of data. Similarly, in a sense, a new data dump when the theologians provide the philosophers with a bunch of new developed doctrine, which is not to say that all it is data. I don't mean to denigrate the work of the Holy Spirit or the deliverances of the councils, but part of what it is things to know and believe. and that's just data.
All right, thank you very much. Our next question comes from Scott Williams. Suppose a metaphysician has proven to you that truth-maker maximalism must be true. Would you be epistemically rational in reducing your confidence in Catholic dogma on this point?
Yep. I'll say a bit more. Yeah, I think the arguments, I think it's a logical deductive derivation from the premises I gave earlier to the conclusion truth-maker maximalism is false. So if I get an argument for the truth of truth-maker maximalism, and gosh darn it, I can't show anything wrong with it. It seems sound to me for all the world. I don't just like ignore my previous argumentation. I think now I have an uh-oh moment where I better look at it. I better reassess all of my premises and all the inferences I employed. And if it comes to light that it just seems to me for all the world that it's an inconsistency, then I'm surely going to reduce my confidence in Catholic dogma. What I'll do first is I'll go knock on all the doors on this floor. This floor is all the philosophers at the University of St. Thomas. And I'll bring a piece of paper with the formally derived argument. And I'll say, guys, we have problems. What's going on? And if it's all for naught, if I find I cannot get away from the contradiction, I think the right thing for me to do is to give up the contradictory view. You know, in this case, since by supposition, I'm believing that truth-maker maximalism is true, I would give up the theological doctrines.
Okay, thank you very much. Our next question is from our own Gavin Kerr. Thank you, Tim, for your paper. I have a question on the identifier of analytic and analytic philosophy for another day, but what I want to ask is about a slightly different conception of truth. Mm-hmm. It seems to be that a Tarskian approach to truth in terms of disquotation is quite amenable to Aquinas' outlook. I think a Tarskian approach to truth leads to the kind of reduction you see applicable to the truth maker approaches you outlined.
I don't think so. By Tarskian disquotation, you mean like the snow is white is true if and only if the snow is white? Like,
yeah, that's the one.
Yeah. So I think that's a sort of, well, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think of that as a sort of correspondence theory of truth. Like the proposition is true just in case it corresponds with how the stuff is out there in the world. And one way to correspond is when the proposition says there aren't any of those things, and then look in the world and there aren't any of those things. So I think there is a way in which you can use the Tarskian sort of approach and Aquinas' approach to get around the reductio, because the Tarskian approach doesn't require that you have truth-maker maximalism, nor does Aquinas' approach. So since neither of those two approaches gave you the thesis required to get the contradiction, you're on safe ground, I think, there.
Could I maybe bounce back on that if there's no other questions? Through the chair, would that be all right? It seems to me that the Tarskian, the disquotation approach, it can be taken to be a correspondence approach, but it seems to me that what the Tarskian approach is after is an identity between the proposition and what that proposition is about. Whereas the correspondence view is not so much an identity, but a correspondence.
When you say an identity, you mean the proposition is identical to the snow that's outside the window? I'm in Minnesota, so there might well be snow out there for all I know.
Not quite. That the propositional content, which is being entertained by the subject, that the form of that content is identical to the form in the world.
Oh, see, I wasn't familiar with Tarski using that sort of form in the world language.
Well, I mean, that's why I think it's amenable to Aquinas. That's how I read Tarski. Now, I know Davidson reads Tarski on a more correspondence sort of view, but I don't think that's essential to Tarski's approach.
Yeah, I don't know if it's essential either. But it's amenable in at least one way of reading Tarski, for sure. Aristotle has that place, well, more than one, but at least in Metaphysics Delta, where he says, to say of what is true is to say of what is that it is. or of what's not that it's not.
Mm.
To say of what's false is to say of what's not that it is,
Mhm.
or of what is that it's not. And if you look at that, I think it looks fairly Tarskian.
Yeah.
And Aquinas picks that right up. You know, in his commentary on metaphysics, he accepts it.
Mhm.
So I think you're right to point out we've got some at least closeness there that can be worked on, if not identity.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, unfortunately, that about does it for our time here in this session. So maybe we can make that our last question of the day. Dr. Powell, thank you so much for the talk, as well as taking the time to be here. Hopefully, and God willing, we can continue these conversations next year at the in-person conference. So that does it for our sessions today. But before we go, I'm going to hand it off to the Dean of Philosophy here at St. Patrick's College, Reverend Professor Thomas Casey, for some closing words.
Thomas Aquinas, I think, says giving thanks is part of the virtue of justice, rendering people what is due to them. And Immanuel Kant says it's a duty. But for me, with apologies to Kant, it's also a pleasure to thank you all. I'd like to thank our president of Maynooth, Michael Mullaney, because he's given us so much encouragement as a small growing faculty, and especially then to Philip Gonzalez and Gavin Kerr, who really put in an enormous amount of work to make this day happen, and it really has unfolded in a marvelous way. Today is the feast of a great Dominican saint, Catherine of Siena, and I find myself situating the speakers. It's a big generalization, but you'll indulge me because it's the end of the day, at least the end of the day in Ireland. I find myself situating speakers in terms of Thomas Aquinas or Catherine of Siena. And when I listen to our initial speakers, Professor Jennifer Martin and Professor Kathleen Smith-Gilson and Philip Gonzalez as well, I felt they were kind of awakening the sleeping beauty of our wonder, if you like. I felt something of the passion and desire of Catherine of Siena. I wrote down some words that when Jennifer spoke about being, promise, hope, beginning, upspringing, wound of the future. So that was wonderful to hear. And then on the other side, I heard, Professor John Betts, systematic, nuanced, thorough. And then his respondent, David Schindler, also exquisitely courteous, but thought-provoking, penetrating questions at the same time. La Professoressa Lorella Congiunti kind of enlarged our horizons, brought in the African and Asian dimension, brought in ecology, and Gavin Kerr, of course, responding to her. Thomas Aquinas comes trippingly off the tongue with Gavin all the time. Professor Tim Powell and Andrew, precision, rigor, exactness. So again, something of Aquinas. As a Jesuit, I find myself attracted by the talks on Shavara, and I found myself going back to that landmark papal encyclical Fides et Ratio to see what it says about the whole question of analogy. And I was really surprised, actually, to find that although there's a certain respect for analogy in the encyclical, there's also a definite wariness about it. And here's a few quotations I came across. It says in number 83, the human being's capacity to know this transcendent and metaphysical, to know transcendent and metaphysical dimensions in a way that is true and certain, albeit imperfect and analogical. And then number 84, faith clearly presupposes that human language is capable of expressing divine and transcendent reality in a universal way. Analogically, it is true, but no less meaningfully for that. And then number 88 says, analyses based on superficial analogies lacking all rational foundation. So I was thinking to myself, gosh, someone reading that encyclical might come to the conclusion that the use of analogy is unhelpful because of all those reasons. And yet I was struck that we can, something that was evident to me in today's talks, that we can rescue analogy in terms of at least Fides et Ratio, that perilous or apparently perilous position it has, if we recall that the encyclical endorses a really expansive, generous view of reason. I mean, after all, it begins with the word telling us that reason is one of the wings by which our spirit arises to contemplate truth. So it's not defending a kind of narrow discursive reason, but that reduces all difference to it slides it into univocity, if you like, but something much, much bigger. And I found that spirit of openness, that spirit of the meta beyond the physical. It's not only in Catherine of Siena, who we celebrate today, who loved God without restrictions and without restraints and without conditions, but I also found it in the papers, in the responses, a sense of an openness, a sense of adventure, a sense of a spark being lit, or as Kathleen Smith Gilson said, the inner dynamite, much more than a spark, of Kierkegaard's fear and trembling. And it gives me a great sense of excitement as I look forward to next year's major conference, the Future of Christian Thinking. I came across, just to finish, a lovely little quotation from a novel, not a high lit novel, but a novel that came out the same year as Fides et Ratio, 1998, by the Canadian Douglas Coupland, Girlfriend in a Coma. And there's a great couple of lines in it. There must be all these people everywhere on earth, so desperate for just the smallest sign that there is something finer or larger or more miraculous about ourselves than we had supposed. How can I give them a spark? So you've really given me a spark, and I know that next year the spark will become, as Kathleen says, it will become really inner dynamite. And so I thank you very much for opening up this horizon of hope. Thank you.
Thanks again, everyone.
So thanks everybody for coming and for participating in it. Keep an eye out on the advertisement for the conference for next year. There will be advertising going out. One can register already at Eventbrite for it. And please do pass on the word. But thanks everybody for coming. Enjoy the rest of your week, and thank you.
Christian thought faces unprecedented challenges, ranging from a denial of metaphysics to previously unforeseen ethical and moral questions arising from contemporary science and ever-advancing technologies. The theme of our 2022 conference, The Future of Christian Thinking, seeks to think from out of these unprecedented challenges, while simultaneously straining to look into a nebulous and unforeseen future. A vast array of many of the foremost thinkers engaged with Christian thought have been invited to speak on these issues. These thinkers are representative of many different schools, approaches, and styles of Christian thought across confessional divides. And together, the ever-pressing question of the future of Christian thinking will be pondered from within an intellectually polyphonic and ecumenical conversation. Conference keynote speakers include Rowan Williams, Eleanor Stump, David Bentley Hart, Robert George, John Milbank, Cyril O'Regan, Thomas Joseph White, D.C. Schindler, Francesca Aaron Murphy, Connor Cunningham, Judith Wolfe, Patrick Lee, Rudy Tavelda, Therese Ann Druart, Philip Rosemond, Metta Lebec, Caitlin Smith-Gilson, John Canassis, and Gavin Kerr. This event will also be used to launch our new lecture series in Christian philosophy with our inaugural lecturer, William Desmond. William Desmond will be followed in the spring of 2023 with Cyril O'Regan as our second speaker in this lecture series. COVID-19 has struck hard at the communal life of the world. One of the ways it has affected academia deeply is in the loss of our beloved communal events of academic conferences. We are all aware that what makes these events beautiful and integral to the meaning of academia, is the overflowing of conversation begun in the keynotes and panel sessions into the communal gathering outside of the formal setting. It is in the breaking of bread and the sharing of wine, in the meeting between old friends and the making of new, that gives flesh and blood to the spirit of the life of the mind and our intellectual endeavors. It is thus with an eager heart that we are able to welcome you with Irish hospitality, amidst the imposing yet inspiring cloistral hush of our historic campus. More information on this event can be found on our website, and registration is via Eventbrite. We would be grateful if you aid us in spreading the word.